The judge looked straight at me and said, "You understood this could cost you your career, and you did it anyway?" I held his gaze and didn't blink. I didn't flinch, because yes, I did. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 34 years old. I'm a licensed social worker in Seattle, and I reported my own brother to Child Protective Services. I watched him sit across from me in that courtroom, dressed in a pressed button-down, eyes red like he'd been crying. He was playing the part of a broken, remorseful father, and half the room believed him. My parents sat right behind him, their arms crossed, their eyes fixed on me like I was the one who'd done something wrong, like I was the villain in this story. My lawyer leaned over and whispered with quiet urgency, "Emily, whatever happens in the next few minutes, don't react." I swallowed hard and nodded. Behind Ryan, in the very last row, sat a small girl with her hands folded neatly in her lap. Lily, 7 years old, staring at the floor. And in that moment, something settled deep in my chest. Not peace, not exactly, but certainty. I didn't regret a single thing, because this didn't start in a courtroom. It started the night she called me crying. "Hi everyone, my name is Emily. I'm 34, and what I'm about to tell you started on a random Tuesday night in Seattle. I was sitting on my couch, still in my work clothes, eating leftover pasta straight from the container. It had been a long day. It had been a long week, honestly. I work for the Department of Child and Family Services here in Washington State. I've been doing this job for almost 9 years. And if you know anything about child welfare work, you know it takes something out of you every single day. I've walked into homes that still haunt me. I've sat across from kids who couldn't even make eye contact. I've filed more reports than I can count. I've testified in court. I've held children's hands while they were placed in foster care. And I've always believed, deep down, that what I was doing was right. That protecting kids was worth whatever it cost. I believed that until it hit my own front door. Now, let me tell you about my brother Ryan. He's 32, 2 years younger than me. Freelancer, charming when he wants to be. The kind of guy who could talk his way out of anything. Growing up, Ryan was the one who got away with everything. And our parents? They let him. Every mistake he made, they found a way to explain it away. Every time he fell, they were right there to catch him. I loved him. I still do, if I'm being honest. But love doesn't make you blind. Or at least, it shouldn't. That Tuesday night, my phone buzzed on the cushion beside me. I looked down and saw a number I recognized but rarely heard from. It was Lily, Ryan's 7-year-old daughter, my niece. I picked up, and before I could even say hello, I heard it. A small voice, barely above a whisper, shaking with something that sounded a lot like fear. She said, "Aunt Emily, can you come?" Right then, my stomach dropped. Something was wrong. I grabbed my keys. 30 minutes later, I was standing in front of his apartment door, and what I found inside changed everything. The door wasn't just closed. It was locked from the outside. I stood in that hallway and stared at the deadbolt, and I felt something cold move through me, not the kind of cold from the November air outside. Something else. Something that settled in my gut and wouldn't let go. I knocked. Nothing. I knocked harder and called out, "Lily? Lily, it's me. It's Aunt Emily." A few seconds of silence, and then I heard it. A small shuffling sound. Then a tiny voice, muffled through the door. She said quietly, almost like she wasn't sure she was allowed to speak, "Aunt Emily, is that really you?" Right then, my chest clenched so hard I almost couldn't breathe. I told her to stay calm, that I was going to get her out, and I went straight downstairs to find the building manager. The landlord, an older guy named Frank, looked confused when I explained the situation. He grabbed his keys without another word and followed me back up. When he turned that lock and pushed the door open, the smell hit me first. Stale air. Something sour underneath it, like the windows hadn't been opened in days. I stepped inside and reached for the light switch. The bulb in the entryway flickered once, then held. What I saw made me stop dead in my tracks. The apartment was cold. Not just cool, but genuinely cold. Like the heat had been off for a while. The curtains were drawn shut. Empty cans of soup and crackers sat on the coffee table. A half-finished juice box on the floor. And in the corner of the living room, curled up on the couch with a blanket pulled all the way up to her chin, was Lily. She was still in her school clothes from what looked like at least a day ago. Her hair was unbrushed. Her eyes were wide and locked onto me the second I walked in, and they were red around the edges like she'd been crying for a long time and had finally run out of tears. I crossed the room fast and knelt down in front of her. I kept my voice steady, even though everything inside me was anything but. I said softly, reaching out to take her hand, "Hey, sweetheart, I'm here. You're okay." Her hand was ice cold. She grabbed onto mine and didn't let go. I looked around the apartment again. No adult, no note, no sign that anyone had checked on her recently. I asked her how long she'd been alone, and she looked down at the blanket and said in a small voice, "Since yesterday morning." Since yesterday morning. I did the math in my head. That was over 30 hours. A 7-year-old girl locked inside an apartment, alone, in the cold, for over 30 hours. I asked Frank quietly if he'd seen Ryan come or go, and he shook his head. Said he hadn't seen him since the day before. I thanked him, told him I'd handle it from here, and he left without pushing back. I think he could see it on my face. I think he knew this wasn't a situation you ask too many questions about. I got Lily's coat from the hook by the door, helped her put it on, and guided her out of that apartment. In the hallway, under the fluorescent lights, I got my first real look at her face. She was pale. She looked smaller than the last time I'd seen her, just a few months back at a birthday dinner. She wasn't crying anymore. She was just quiet. Too quiet for a 7-year-old. And that silence scared me more than anything else in that apartment. I buckled her into the back seat of my car, turned the heat all the way up, and started driving. I didn't know where Ryan was. I didn't call him yet. I just drove, watching her in the rearview mirror as she slowly stopped shivering. But what scared me more wasn't the apartment. It wasn't the locked door, or the empty food cans, or the cold. It was what she said next in the car. She kept saying sorry. That's the thing that broke me. Not the locked door, not the cold apartment, not even the 30 hours alone. It was the apologies. We'd been driving for maybe 10 minutes when I heard her small voice from the back seat say, "Aunt Emily, I'm sorry for calling you." I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw her sitting perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, eyes down, like she was bracing for something. I kept my voice gentle and told her, "Don't ever apologize for calling me, okay? Ever." She nodded slowly, but didn't look convinced. A few minutes passed. Then she asked, barely above a whisper, "Can I turn the heat up a little more? If that's okay? If that's okay?" A 7-year-old asking permission to be warm. Right then, something inside me cracked wide open. I reached over and cranked the heat all the way up without a word. And I had to press my lips together hard to keep myself together. I pulled into a drive-thru, ordered her some food, and when I handed the bag back to her, she held it in her lap and looked at me in the mirror and asked, "Is it okay if I eat this?" I had to look away for a second. I told her yes, of course it was okay, and she said thank you so quietly I almost didn't hear it. She ate slowly, carefully, like she was trying not to make a mess, like she was worried about taking up too much space. I'd seen this before. In my work, I'd sat across from kids who moved through the world like they were always one wrong, move away from being in trouble. Kids who had learned to shrink themselves down to nothing just to feel safe. I knew exactly what I was looking at, but knowing it professionally and watching it happen to your own niece are two completely different things. After a while, when she'd finished eating and the car was warm and quiet, I asked her as gently as I could, "Lily, has this happened before? Being home by yourself?" She was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that I thought she might not answer. Then she nodded. Just once. Small. Like she wasn't sure she was allowed to admit it. I asked her how many times, and she looked out the window and said, a few times. But usually, just one night. I kept my eyes on the road and asked, and last night was longer than usual? Another small nod. Then she said, still looking out the window, her voice so flat it hurt to hear it, he forgets sometimes that I'm there. He forgets that she's there. I gripped the steering wheel and said nothing. Because what do you say to that? What words exist for a moment like that? I let the silence sit for a minute, and then I heard her voice again. Softer this time. Almost like she was talking to herself more than to me. She said, I don't want him to get in trouble. It's not his fault. I get scared at night. I glanced in the mirror. She was still looking out the window, small face, serious eyes, carrying something no 7-year-old should ever have to carry, and that was the moment I knew, not just as an aunt. As a professional who had spent nearly a decade working these exact cases, this wasn't a one-time lapse. This was a pattern. This was neglect. And what made it worse, what made it so much harder to sit with, was that she was defending him. She was scared and cold and hungry and alone, and her first instinct was to protect her father. I've seen that before too. Kids who love the very people who hurt them. Kids who would rather blame themselves than believe that a parent could truly let them down. That's one of the cruelest things neglect does. It doesn't just take from a child. It teaches them to apologize for being taken from. By the time I pulled up to my apartment building, Lily had fallen asleep in the back seat. I sat there for a minute with the engine running, watching her in the mirror. Her face was finally relaxed, finally peaceful. And I made myself a promise right then and there that I would not look away from this, that I would not let it go. But even as I made that promise, I could feel the weight of what it would cost me pressing down on my chest. That night, I didn't sleep, because I knew what I was supposed to do. I'd told other people to do it 100 times, but I didn't know if I could do it to my own family. I thought my parents would be angry at him. I really did. I drove to their house 2 days later with Lily staying at mine, and I genuinely believed that when I laid out what I'd found, when I described that cold apartment and that locked door, and a 7-year-old girl who apologized for being hungry, they would be horrified. They would be on my side. I was wrong. My mom opened the door and pulled me into a hug, and for just a second it felt normal. It felt like coming home. Then I stepped inside and saw my dad sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee, and Ryan was already there, sitting right across from him, relaxed, like nothing had happened. The moment I walked in and our eyes met, Ryan looked away first. He picked up his mug and stared into it like it held something fascinating. My mom gestured toward the table and said with a tight smile, moving toward the kitchen, "Sit down, Emily. I made coffee." I sat. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then I looked at my parents and said, steady as I could manage, "I need to talk to you both about what I found at Ryan's apartment 2 nights ago." My dad set his mug down. My mom came back from the kitchen and stood near the counter with her arms crossed loosely, not defensive yet, just waiting. So I told them. All of it. The locked door. Frank the landlord. The cold. The food situation. The 30+ hours alone. Lily asking permission to eat. What she told me in the car about it happening before. I laid it all out clearly, the same way I would in a case review at work. Calm. Factual. Specific. When I finished, the kitchen was quiet for a few seconds. Then my mom let out a long breath and said, shaking her head slowly, "Emily, Ryan is going through a really hard time right now." Right then, something shifted in my chest. Not surprise. Something closer to dread. I asked, keeping my voice level. What does that have to do with Lily being locked inside alone for 30 hours? My dad leaned forward and said with the kind of tone that meant the conversation was already over in his mind. He's overwhelmed. He's been struggling with work, with the bills, with everything. He's doing the best he can. I looked at Ryan. He was still staring at his mug, not defending himself, not apologizing, Just sitting there, letting our parents do the work for him, like he always had, I said. And I made sure my voice didn't shake. His Bess left a 7-year-old alone in a cold apartment overnight. Twice, at least. My mom's expression shifted then. Not toward concern, toward something else, she said. And I will never forget the way she said it, like I was the one causing the problem. You know how sensitive Lily is. She probably made it sound worse than it was. Made it sound worse than it was. I felt the air leave my lungs. I looked at my mother, the woman who raised me, who taught me right from wrong. And I didn't recognize the logic she was using. I've heard that exact sentence before. Sitting across from parents in formal interviews, parents whose kids had been taken to the hospital, parents who had every reason in the world to minimize what happened. I never thought I'd hear it at my own family's kitchen table. I tried one more time. I looked at my dad and said directly, "If a stranger's kid had been found in those conditions, you know what would happen. You know what I'm required to do." My dad's jaw tightened. He said flatly, leaning back in his chair, "This is family, Emily. You handle family differently." And there it was. Family. That word that gets used like a shield. Like it makes the rules different. Like it makes a child's suffering negotiable. Ryan finally spoke up then. He looked at me for the first time since I'd walked in, and his voice was quiet, almost soft. And he said, "I made a mistake. It won't happen again. Don't blow this up into something it isn't. Don't blow this up." I sat there and looked at the three of them, my parents and my brother, all arranged on the same side of an invisible line. And I realized with a clarity that felt like ice water that they weren't going to help me. They were going to protect him. They had always protected him. And if I pushed this further, if I did what I knew I needed to do, I wasn't just going to be on the other side of that line. I was going to be cut off from everything on this side of it entirely. My mom reached over and put her hand on my arm and said gently, like she was offering me a way out, "Just let it go this time, honey. Talk to him. Keep an eye on things. You don't need to make this official. Let it go. Keep an eye on things." I've given that advice to people before too. People who weren't ready to act. People who were scared. And I always knew, every single time, that keeping an eye on things wasn't enough. That waiting for the next incident meant there would be a next incident. But sitting in that kitchen, with my mom's hand on my arm and my dad's hard eyes watching me and my brother staring at his coffee mug, I felt the pull of it. The pull of just nodding. Of letting it be a family matter. Of choosing the easier, quieter version of what came next. That's when I realized that if I reported him, I wouldn't just lose my brother. I'd lose all of them. I've told people to report abuse my entire career. I've sat across from neighbors, teachers, relatives, strangers, and I've looked them in the eye and said, "If you see something, you have to say something." I've explained mandatory reporting laws. I've walked people through the process. I've reassured them that it was the right thing to do. I've said those words so many times, they became almost automatic. But I'd never had to say them to myself, about my own blood. I got home that night and the apartment was quiet. Lily was asleep in my guest room. I'd checked on her twice already before I even took my coat off. She was curled up under the comforter with just the top of her head visible, her breathing slow and even, finally getting the kind of sleep a kid her age was supposed to get. I stood in the doorway for a moment and just watched her. Then I went to the kitchen and sat down at the table. I didn't turn on the TV. I didn't make tea. I just sat there in the quiet with my hands flat on the table and let myself think through all of it. Because I had to be honest with myself, not as Ryan's sister, as a professional, as someone who had spent 9 years learning exactly what patterns like this lead to if nobody steps in. And when I stripped away the family part of it, when I looked at the facts, the way I would look at any case that landed on my desk, the picture was not ambiguous. A child left alone repeatedly. Locked inside. No food preparation. No emergency contact reached. A child who had learned to apologize for being hungry. A child who described her father forgetting she existed. Any one of those things alone would have raised flags. All of them together told a story I already knew the ending of if nothing changed. I got up and poured myself a glass of water and stood at the counter and thought about what reporting would actually mean. It would mean an official investigation. It would mean CPS coming in, interviewing Lily, assessing Ryan. It could mean Ryan losing custody temporarily. It could mean a court case. It could mean my parents never speaking to me again. And it could mean something else too, something that sat in my stomach like a stone. It could mean my license. There are rules about conflicts of interest in this field. Reporting a family member when you're a social worker yourself puts you in complicated territory professionally. My supervisor would have to be notified. There could be questions about my judgment, my objectivity. I had worked for 9 years to build a career I was proud of. 9 years of hard cases and late nights and moments that followed me home. And one phone call could put all of that under a microscope. I stood there at that counter for a long time, long enough that the ice in my water melted. I thought about what my mom said. Let it go this time. Keep an eye on things. I thought about my dad's face when he said this is family. I thought about Ryan sitting there letting them fight his battles, the same way he always had. And then I thought about Lily asking if it was okay to eat. I pushed off the counter and walked back down the hallway and stopped at the guest room door again. She hadn't moved. Still curled up. Still breathing slowly. Still finally safe for one night. I thought about what happens to kids when the adults around them keep choosing to look away. I've seen those outcomes. I've held those files. I visited those hospital rooms. I knew exactly what the statistics looked like when neglect went unaddressed, when families closed ranks, when everyone agreed to keep it quiet just one more time. I went back to the kitchen. I picked up my phone. I set it down. I picked it up again. My hands were steady. My heart was not. I thought about Ryan at 7 years old, the same age Lily was now, running through the backyard of our parents' house, laughing at something I'd said. I thought about the brother I grew up with before everything got complicated. I thought about how much I had wanted, sitting in that kitchen with my parents, for someone to tell me there was another way. But there wasn't. There wasn't another way that kept Lily safe. And keeping Lily safe was the only thing that actually mattered. So I called. I called the CPS hotline and I gave them my name and my professional credentials, and I reported my brother Ryan Carter for child neglect. I gave them the date of the incident. I gave them the details. I answered every question they asked me clearly and completely. When I hung up, I sat there for a moment, in the silence of my kitchen. No relief. No sense of righteousness. Just a hollow, aching feeling in my chest and the quiet sound of a little girl breathing steadily down the hall. I thought the hardest part was over. I had absolutely no idea that was just the beginning. After the report, everything went quiet. Too quiet. Ryan didn't call, didn't text, didn't show up at my door. My parents went silent too, the kind of silence that isn't peaceful, the kind that has weight to it, that presses against you every time you pick up your phone and see no new messages from numbers you've known your whole life. My mom, who used to check in on me at least twice a week, stopped reaching out entirely. My dad didn't even send a one-line text. It was like I had stepped off the edge of the family and they had all agreed, without saying a word to me directly, to let me fall. CPS opened the investigation within 48 hours of my call. A caseworker I didn't personally know, which I was grateful for, was assigned to Lily's case. There were interviews, a home assessment of Ryan's apartment, a review of Lily's school attendance records and teacher observations. I cooperated fully and stayed out of the way professionally, because the last thing I wanted was to give anyone a reason to question the validity of what I'd reported. My supervisor at work found out, of course. I told her myself before anyone else did, because that's the kind of thing you get ahead of or it gets ahead of you. She listened carefully, asked the right questions, and told me she respected that I'd handled it the way I did. But I could see it in her eyes, that careful, measured look she got when something complicated landed on her plate. She told me to document everything, so I did. In the middle of all of that, Lily stayed with me. CPS allowed it as a temporary arrangement while the investigation was ongoing, given that I was a licensed professional with a clean record and an established relationship with the child. And slowly, in the quiet of my apartment, something started to shift in her. It didn't happen all at once. It happened in small moments I almost missed if I wasn't paying attention. The first time she laughed at something on TV without covering her mouth, like she wasn't supposed to make noise. The morning she came into the kitchen and poured herself a glass of juice without asking me first, then looked up and caught herself, and I just smiled at her and said, "Good morning," like it was the most normal thing in the world, because it was. The afternoon she spread her homework out across my entire coffee table and didn't apologize once for taking up space. She started seeing a therapist named Dr. Paulson twice a week. I drove her to every appointment and waited in the lobby with bad coffee and a book I never actually read. I didn't ask Lily what they talked about in those sessions. That wasn't my place. But I watched what happened to her between appointments, and that told me enough. She started sleeping through the night. She stopped flinching when I raised my voice to call her for dinner from the other room. She started leaving her shoes in the middle of the hallway like a normal kid and forgetting to put her dishes in the sink and asking for seconds at dinner without that careful, watchful look in her eyes first. Little things. Normal things. Things that shouldn't have been remarkable but were, because of how long she'd gone without them. One evening, about 3 weeks in, I was sitting on the couch grading some training materials for work, and Lily came and dropped down beside me and leaned her head against my arm without saying anything. Just like that. Like it was nothing. Like she'd always done it. I didn't move. I didn't make a big deal out of it. I just let her sit there and kept reading, and after a minute I felt her relax completely against me, her whole small body just letting go of something. Right then, a quiet warmth moved through me that I hadn't felt in a long time. For a while, I started to think that maybe this was how the story ended, quietly. With Lily getting better, and the legal process running its course, and everyone eventually finding their way back to something manageable, I let myself believe that for a few weeks. I needed to. Then the letter arrived. A thick envelope from a law office downtown, addressed to Lily, care of me. And just like that, the quiet was over. It wasn't just a letter, it was a number big enough to change everything. I set the envelope on the kitchen table and stared at it for a full minute before I opened it. It was addressed to Lily, care of Emily Carter, from a law firm I didn't recognize downtown. My first thought was that it was something connected to the CPS case, some kind of legal notification. But the return address wasn't a government office. It was a private firm. I slid a finger under the seal and pulled out the papers inside. It took me a few seconds to understand what I was reading. Then I read it again. Lily's paternal grandfather, Ryan's father-in-law, the father of his ex-wife Claire, who had passed away 2 years earlier from a sudden illness, had died 6 weeks ago. I hadn't known. Nobody had told me. And in his will, he had left a substantial portion of his estate directly to Lily, his only grandchild. I turned to the second page and found the number. I sat down. I hadn't even realized I was still standing. The trust fund established in Lily's name was just over $400,000, to be held and managed until she turned 25, with provisions for educational expenses and medical costs accessible before that. $400,000. Left to a 7-year-old girl who 3 months ago had been asking permission to turn up the heat. I sat at that table for a long time. Part of me felt something close to relief, the kind that comes from knowing that whatever happened next, Lily would have something solid under her feet when she grew up, a safety net that nobody could take from her. But another part of me, the part that had spent 9 years in child welfare and knew exactly how money changed the dynamics of custody situations, felt the first cold edge of something I didn't want to name yet. I called a family attorney I'd worked with professionally before, a woman named Patricia, who was sharp and didn't sugarcoat things. I explained the situation and asked her to walk me through the legal implications. She listened carefully and then was quiet for a moment before she spoke. She told me, choosing her words with the kind of precision that meant she was being very deliberate, that the existence of a significant trust fund in a child's name, in the middle of an open custody and neglect investigation, created what she called a changed incentive landscape. I asked her to say that in plain English. She said directly, without softening it. It means people who weren't paying attention before are going to start paying attention now. I knew what she meant. I knew exactly what she meant. Because I'd seen it before too, not often, but enough. Cases where a child's financial situation suddenly made them a lot more interesting to adults who hadn't shown much interest before. Cases where parents who had been largely absent started showing up to every hearing, every meeting, every supervised visit, dressed well and speaking carefully and performing a version of themselves that bore very little resemblance to who they actually were. I asked Patricia what I should do. She told me to make sure I was formally documented as Lily's current caregiver, to notify the CPS caseworker about the inheritance immediately and in writing, and to be prepared for the situation to get significantly more complicated in the coming weeks. I thanked her and hung up and sat there in my quiet kitchen, looking at those papers spread out on the table. The trust documents, the attorney's contact information, the number, $400,000. I thought about Lily in the next room, doing her homework, completely unaware that anything had changed. And I thought about Ryan, about where he was, about the silence that had stretched out over the past 4 months with no contact, no word, nothing. I thought about whether that silence was going to hold. Exactly 2 weeks later, my phone rang. I looked down at the screen. I saw his name. And I knew, before I even answered, that Patricia had been right. Everything was about to get a lot more complicated. His voice was softer than I'd ever heard it. That's the first thing I noticed. Not angry, not defensive. Soft, almost gentle. And that scared me more than anything else he could have said. I let it ring 3 times before I picked up. I needed those 3 seconds to steady myself, to remind myself of everything I knew, everything I'd seen, everything Lily had told me in that car on that cold night 4 months ago. I answered and said his name, just that, nothing else. And he said, and I could hear him exhale first, like he'd been rehearsing this moment, Emily, I know I'm the last person you want to hear from right now. I didn't agree or disagree. I just waited. He kept going. He told me he'd been doing a lot of thinking, that he'd gotten into therapy, that he understood now how serious things had been and how badly he'd handled everything. His voice had that careful, measured quality to it, the kind that doesn't come naturally, the kind people practice. He said, and I noticed he paused just slightly before this part, like he wanted to make sure I was still listening. I know I let her down. I know I let you down. But I'm her father, Emily. And I want to be there for her the right way this time. I stood in my kitchen with the phone pressed to my ear and looked out the window at the gray Seattle sky and said nothing for a moment. Then I asked him quietly, because I needed to hear how he answered it. What changed, Ryan? He said he'd hit rock bottom. That losing Lily had been a wake-up call. That he wasn't the same person he was 4 months ago. All the right words. Every single one of them. Arranged in exactly the right order. I've sat across from parents in formal reunification meetings who used the exact same language. Some of them meant it. Some of them didn't. The hard part of my job, the part that never got easier no matter how many years I did it, was figuring out which was which. I told him I was glad he was getting help. I meant that part. Then I told him that any contact with Lily right now had to go through the proper legal channels, through the caseworker, through the court process. His voice shifted just slightly when I said that. Still soft, but with something underneath it now. Something tighter. He said, I'm not trying to go around the system, Emily. I just want to talk to my daughter. I said I understood that, and I repeated that the right way to do that was through the process that was already in place. There was a pause, long enough to be deliberate. Then he said, and this is the part that told me everything I needed to know. She has money now, Emily. A lot of it. And I'm still her legal father. Right then, my whole body went still. There it was. $400,000 sitting in a trust fund, and a father who hadn't called once in 4 months, suddenly finding his voice again the moment he found out about it. I kept my tone even. I told him that Lily's financial situation had no bearing on the legal process and that he should direct any concerns to his attorney. He was quiet again. Then he said, softer again, back to that rehearsed gentleness, "I don't want this to turn into a war, Emily. I really don't. I just want my daughter back. I'm asking you, as my sister, to not make this harder than it has to be." As his sister, I almost said something then. I almost let 9 years of professional discipline slip and said everything I was thinking out loud. But I didn't. I told him to contact his attorney, and I ended the call. I set the phone face down on the counter and stood there with both hands flat on the cold tile and just breathed for a minute. I thought about that soft voice, that careful language, that one sentence about the money dropped right in the middle of all the apologies like a stone into still water. And I thought about Lily in the next room, who had just started sleeping through the night, who had just started leaving her shoes in the hallway and not apologizing for it, who had just, for the first time in as long as I could remember, started to look like a kid again. I picked my phone back up and sent Patricia a message. Told her Ryan had made contact and what he'd said. She responded within the hour. Her message was short and direct. She said, "Get ready, this is going to court." A week later, I received court papers on my doorstep. Ryan was filing for full custody reinstatement. And as I stood there on my front step in the cold morning air reading through the legal language, I understood with total clarity that this was never about being a father again. This was about $400,000. And he was going to use every tool available to him to get his hands on it. In that courtroom, everyone suddenly remembered how much they loved her. Ryan walked in wearing a charcoal gray suit I'd never seen before, hair neatly combed, carrying a leather folder like he was presenting a business case. He sat at the plaintiff's table with his attorney and kept his expression careful, humble, pained. The performance was polished. I'll give him that. My parents sat directly behind him in the gallery. My mom in her church blouse. My dad with his hands folded. They didn't look at me when I walked in. Not once. Ryan's attorney opened by painting a picture of a father who had struggled, stumbled, but had genuinely transformed. He submitted documentation from Ryan's therapist, confirming 12 weeks of consistent attendance, character references from 2 neighbors and a former colleague, a letter from a parenting class Ryan had completed 6 weeks prior, all of it clean, all of it timed perfectly. Then it was our turn. Patricia stood up and methodically walked the court through the documented facts. The locked door, the 30-plus hours, the temperature of the apartment, Lily's school records showing chronic fatigue and declining concentration in the months before the incident, the caseworker's formal findings. Ryan's attorney objected twice. The judge overruled both times. Then things got uglier. Ryan's attorney turned his attention to me. He argued that my role in this situation represented a conflict of interest, that as a social worker I had used my professional access and authority to influence the investigation in my favor, and that my motivations for seeking guardianship of Lily were not purely protective. He said the word controlling twice. He implied, without quite saying it directly, that I had manufactured a crisis to position myself as Lily's caregiver. Right then, my jaw tightened so hard it ached. I felt Patricia's hand press briefly on my arm beside me, a quiet signal. Hold it together. So I did. What Ryan's attorney didn't anticipate was Lily. Dr. Paulson, her therapist, had submitted a detailed clinical report to the court. The judge had reviewed it in chambers beforehand. And when the judge asked whether Lily's own account had been documented, Patricia confirmed it had, and the report was entered into evidence. The courtroom got very quiet, while the judge reviewed the relevant sections. I watched Ryan's face during those few minutes. The careful expression held, but something behind his eyes shifted, a tightening, a recalculation. The caseworker took the stand and answered every question directly and without hesitation. She described Lily's condition at the start of her involvement, She described the progress Lily had made in the months since. She described, in clinical and specific language, what returning Lily to her father's sole custody without significant structural safeguards would likely mean for a child at this stage of trauma recovery. Ryan's attorney pushed back hard on that last part. The caseworker didn't move an inch. When the judge finally spoke, the room went completely still. He said he was not prepared to rule on full custody reinstatement at this time. He ordered continued supervised visitation for Ryan, mandatory ongoing therapy for both Ryan and Lily separately, and a formal review in 6 months. He looked at Ryan directly and said, with the kind of quiet authority that doesn't need volume behind it, that the court's priority was the child's well-being and nothing else. I didn't feel relief when he finished. I expected to, but what I actually felt was something harder to name. Something that sat right at the intersection of exhaustion and grief, and a strange, aching kind of love for that little girl sitting in the back row with her hands folded in her lap. Because winning in that courtroom didn't give me back my family. It didn't undo any of it. It just meant we could keep going. 3 months have passed since the court ruling, and my life doesn't look anything like it used to. I still live in the same apartment. I still drive the same car. I still show up to the same job every Monday morning and sit across from families in crisis and try to help them find a way through. But everything underneath all of that is different now. Lily is still with me. The court extended the temporary guardianship arrangement, pending the 6-month review, and for right now, this is home for both of us. She's in 2nd grade at the school 2 blocks away. She walks there every morning with her backpack and her water bottle, and her hair in 2 uneven ponytails, because she insists on doing it herself now, and I let her, because that kind of insistence is exactly what I want to see from her. She still sees Dr. Paulson every week. She still has hard nights sometimes. She still occasionally goes quiet in a way that tells me something is sitting heavy on her that she hasn't figured out how to say yet, but she also laughs now. Genuinely, freely, the kind of laugh that comes from somewhere deep and unguarded. She laughs at silly things on TV, and at her own jokes that don't quite land, and at the faces I make when she beats me at card games. That laugh is the most important sound in my apartment. Ryan has his supervised visits. Every other Saturday, 2 hours, at a neutral location with a court-appointed supervisor present. I don't attend. That's by design, both legally and personally. Lily comes home from those visits quiet sometimes. Other times, she seems okay. I don't push her either way. I just make sure she knows she can talk to me whenever she's ready. Whether Ryan is genuinely changing or simply doing what he needs to do to get back into the picture, I honestly don't know. Maybe both things are true at once. People are complicated that way. What I do know is that the money is fully protected. The trust is locked down tight, managed by an independent trustee appointed by the court, completely inaccessible to Ryan. Patricia made sure of that. My parents haven't called. Not once since the ruling. My mom sent a card at Christmas, one of those generic ones with a winter scene on the front, signed just with her name. No message inside. I held it for a long time before I put it on the counter, and I thought about everything that used to be on the other side of that signature. All the Sunday dinners and the phone calls and the arguments and the history. I thought about how a family can be right there in your hands and then just not be anymore. That grief is real. I'm not going to pretend it isn't. Losing them is something I carry every single day. But here's what I know now, the thing I didn't fully understand even after 9 years of doing this work. You can love someone completely and still choose to protect someone else from them. Those two things can exist at the same time. Love doesn't cancel out responsibility, and responsibility doesn't cancel out love. It just means you have to decide, when the moment comes, which one you're going to act on. I acted on responsibility, and I'd do it again, every single time. 3 months ago, standing outside that courtroom, my lawyer asked me if I was okay. I told her I wasn't sure yet. I'm still not completely sure. But I look at Lily at the breakfast table in the morning, eating her cereal and arguing with me about whether cartoons count as educational television, and I think that some things don't need to be fully resolved to be right. Some things just need to be done. So if you're sitting there right now, listening to this, and you're in a situation where doing the right thing means losing people you love, I'm not going to tell you it doesn't hurt. It does. It hurts in ways I didn't fully anticipate and still don't have words for. But I will tell you this: a child's safety is not negotiable, not for family loyalty, not for keeping the peace, not for any reason. If you had to choose between your family and a child's safety, what would you do? I know what I did, and I know I'd do it again. Let me know in the comments. I read every single one.